cold air hit my face like a wet blade the second I stepped out of those sliding glass doors, but the heavy weight of the television box in my arms felt like a trophy that made the 3-hour wait in the freezing rain worth every grueling second. I didn't realize that by being the last person to snag the doorbuster deal, I had also made myself the most visible target for the shadows lurking at the edge of the asphalt. The parking lot was a vast, shimmering desert of black oil and frozen puddles, and my car was parked so far away in the overflow lot that the store's neon signs looked like tiny, flickering toys in the distance. I adjusted my grip on the cardboard, the sharp edges digging into my frozen fingers, and I started the long trek across the empty rows. It is strange how a place that was filled with thousands of screaming people just an hour ago could suddenly feel like a graveyard where the only sound is the rhythmic scuff of my own boots. I took 10 steps before the first prickle of unease crawled up my spine, a sensation that told me I was no longer the only person moving in the dark. I stopped and looked over my shoulder, but all I saw were rows of silent cars and the swaying branches of the perimeter trees. Why did the mall management decide to turn off the furthest stadium lights so early on the busiest night of the year? I kept walking, faster now, my breath coming out in thick white plumes that clouded my vision every time I exhaled. Then I heard it. A car door slammed somewhere to my left, but there were no headlights, no engine starting, just the metallic thud of a heavy door closing with a finality that made my heart skip a beat. I told myself I was being paranoid because the news is always full of horror stories during the holidays. But then I heard the footsteps. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. It was the heavy, deliberate crunch of rubber soles on gravel, keeping pace with me from the next row over. "Hey, friend, that looks pretty heavy. Do you need a hand with that?" A voice called out from the darkness. It sounded friendly enough, but there was a jagged edge to it, a predatory hunger that didn't match the helpful words. I didn't turn around to look because I knew that if I made eye contact, the game would officially begin and I wasn't ready to play. I kept my head down and ignored him, my muscles screaming as I tried to shift the 70-pound box to a more secure position so I could run if I had to. "I'm talking to you, man. It's not polite to ignore someone offering to help out a fellow shopper," the voice said, and this time, it was closer. I could hear the sound of a second pair of feet now, stepping out from behind a large SUV. There were two of them. One was tall and wearing a dark hoodie that obscured his face, while the other was shorter, moving with a nervous, twitchy energy that was even more terrifying than the silence of his partner. I reached the edge of the overflow lot where the pavement turned into cracked concrete and dead grass, and I realized with a sinking horror that my car was the only one left in this section. I was trapped in a dead zone. "I'm fine, thanks. My ride is right here," I lied, my voice cracking just enough to betray the terror that was currently flooding my system with adrenaline. I reached into my pocket, fumbling for my keys, praying that the remote start would work from this distance so I could at least have the headlights to see by. I clicked the button frantically, and 30 yards away, my old sedan chirped and the amber lights flashed, cutting through the gloom like a lighthouse. The flash of light revealed the two men clearly for a split second. The tall one was holding something metallic in his right hand, a short length of pipe or a crowbar that he was tapping against his palm in a slow, rhythmic beat. The shorter one had his hands buried deep in his pockets, his eyes darting back and forth to ensure no security patrols were roaming this far out. They weren't here for the television. They were here because they knew that anyone carrying a box that big probably had a wallet full of cash and a mind distracted by the thrill of the hunt. "Just put the box down and leave the keys in the door, and we can all go home and enjoy the holiday," the tall one said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl as he stepped into the light of my car's blinkers. I knew that if I dropped the box, I was giving up my only shield, but if I kept holding it, I couldn't defend myself or get the door open fast enough. Every second felt like an hour as I calculated the distance between me and the driver's side door. I started to shuffle backward, keeping the heavy box between me and the man with the pipe, my eyes locked on his movements. He lunged forward suddenly, not a full charge, but a test of my reflexes to see if I would trip or scream. I didn't scream. I just swung the corner of the heavy box toward him, using the momentum of the weight to force him to step back. "Stay back!" I yelled, the sound echoing off the distant brick walls of the shopping center. The shorter man started circling to my right, trying to get behind me where I wouldn't be able to see him coming. This was the moment where the fear turned into a cold, hard knot of survival instinct. I realized that they didn't want a loud scene. They wanted a quick, quiet robbery in the dark. I reached my car and leaned my back against the cold metal of the door, the box still clutched to my chest like a suit of armor. My fingers found the door handle, but I knew that the second I turned to pull it open, the tall one would close the gap and the pipe would find the back of my skull. "You're making this way harder than it needs to be, kid," the tall one whispered, his face now visible under the faint glow of the interior car light. He looked tired and desperate, which made him infinitely more dangerous because he had nothing left to lose. He raised the pipe, and I knew he was going to swing. I didn't try to open the door. Instead, I pressed the panic button on my key fob. The horn began to blare in a rhythmic, ear-piercing scream, and the headlights began to flash violently, turning the parking lot into a strobe-lit nightmare. The sudden explosion of noise and light stunned them for a fraction of a second, which was all the time I needed. I shoved the heavy television box forward with every ounce of strength I had left, catching the tall man square in the chest and knocking him backward into his accomplice. They tumbled to the ground in a heap of limbs and cardboard. I didn't wait to see if they were hurt. I ripped the door open, dove into the driver's seat, and slammed the lock button down just as a heavy blow struck the window. The glass didn't shatter, but the spiderweb of cracks that appeared right in front of my face was a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. I put the car in reverse and floored it, the tires screaming against the pavement as I tore away from the two figures standing in the middle of the empty lot. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit gas station 5 miles away, my hands shaking so hard I could barely turn the engine off. I looked into the back seat at the empty space where the TV should have been, and I started to laugh, a jagged, shaky sound that bordered on a sob. I had spent the night hunting for a bargain, but in the end, I had paid for my life with a $500 piece of plastic and glass. It was the best deal I had ever made. The silence of a 400,000 square foot warehouse at 3 in the morning is not a true silence, but rather a predatory hum of conveyors and cooling fans that masks the sound of a killer's footsteps. I was standing on the elevated manager's catwalk, looking down at the labyrinth of steel racking and yellow safety lines, when the first light sector went dark without a single command from my terminal. It wasn't a power flicker or a mechanical surge, but a deliberate, manual override that started at the far north emergency exit and began marching toward the center of the floor like a spreading ink blot. I grabbed my radio to call the night security lead, but all that came out of the speaker was a low, rhythmic scratching sound, followed by the heavy, distorted breathing of someone who wanted me to know they were listening. I am the floor supervisor for one of the largest distribution hubs in the state, and on Black Friday, this building is supposed to be a fortress of productivity. Yet tonight, a glitch in the scheduling software had left me entirely alone for a 4-hour gap. I had been enjoying the solitude, catching up on inventory logs in the glass-walled office, until the motion sensors in Sector 4 started tripping one by one in a perfect sequence. Someone was walking through the aisles, not hiding, but navigating the shadows with a familiarity that chilled my blood, because only 3 people had the bypass codes for this facility. One was on vacation, one was me, and the third was a man named Miller who had been escorted out in handcuffs 2 weeks ago after threatening to burn the place down with me inside it. I looked at the monitor on my desk, the graininess of the CCTV feed making the vast rows of shelves look like a jagged mountain range in a nightmare. I saw a flicker of movement near the heavy machinery bay, a tall silhouette dressed in the high-visibility vest of a floor worker. But the way he moved was wrong, far too slow and far too purposeful for someone looking for a lost shipment. He stopped directly under one of the few remaining lights and looked straight up into the camera lens. His face obscured by a dark gaiter, but I recognized the cold, hollow stare of the man who had promised to settle the score. He didn't wave or shout. He simply reached out and disconnected the camera cable, the screen on my desk turning into a wall of static that reflected my own terrified expression. I knew I had to get to the main exit, but the catwalk I was standing on was 100 yards long and completely exposed to the floor below. I stayed low, crawling on my hands and knees across the cold steel grating, the sound of my own heartbeat thumping against the floorboards like a drum. Every time I moved, the metal creaked, and I would freeze, praying that the ambient noise of the ventilation system would swallow the sound of my escape. I reached the end of the rail and looked down at the packing station, seeing the heavy rolls of industrial plastic and the sharp cutting blades of the tape dispensers glowing under the emergency lights. Then the main conveyor belt started to move. The loud, mechanical groan of the motors echoed through the empty cavern of the warehouse. A sound that should have been comforting but was now terrifying because I hadn't started the line. The rollers began to spin, and the heavy rubber belts hissed as they gained speed, creating a wall of noise that meant I could no longer hear where he was. I scrambled down the narrow spiral staircase, my boots clattering against the steps, and hit the concrete floor with a jar that sent a spike of pain through my ankles. I didn't stop to breathe. I ran toward the shipping office, hoping to find a landline that hadn't been tampered with or a heavy tool to defend myself. As I rounded the corner of aisle 12, I saw the first sign that he wasn't just here to scare me. A heavy pallet jack had been wedged firmly against the handles of the primary fire exit, its steel forks driven into the door frame so tightly that no amount of human strength could budge it. He was sealing the tomb row by row, and he was doing it with the precision of a man who had spent 10 years learning every inch of this layout. I turned to run toward the loading docks, but a heavy shadow stepped out from behind a stack of shipping crates, blocking my path to the only other way out. "You always were a stickler for the rules, weren't you?" The voice echoed through the dark, sounding hollow and metallic as it bounced off the corrugated tin walls. I couldn't see his face, but I could see the long, heavy wrench he was swinging in a slow circle, the metal catching the faint red glow of the exit signs. I backed away, my hands held out in front of me, my mind racing through the inventory of the aisle I was trapped in. I was in the chemicals and solvents section, a place filled with pressurized cans and flammable liquids that were usually handled with extreme caution. "Miller, listen to me. The police are already on their way because the alarm triggered when you cut the cameras." I lied, my voice shaking so violently I could barely form the words. He laughed, a dry, raspy sound that made my skin crawl, and he took a long, heavy step toward me, the wrench whistling through the air. "The alarms only work if the phone lines are connected, and you know as well as I do that the junction box is outside in the yard," he replied, his pace quickening as he realized I was cornerized between 2 rows of towering shelves. I reached behind me, my fingers brushing against a heavy gallon jug of industrial floor degreaser, and I didn't think, I just acted. I swung the heavy plastic container with both hands, hurling it at his feet just as he lunged forward with the wrench. The jug burst on impact, sending a slick, oily wave of chemicals across the polished concrete floor. His lead foot hit the liquid and shot forward, his legs flying out from under him as gravity took hold with a violent force. He hit the floor hard, the back of his head bouncing off the concrete with a sickening thud that echoed through the silent aisle. He wasn't dead, but he was dazed, his eyes rolling back in his head as he struggled to find his grip on the slippery floor. I didn't wait to see if he would get up. I turned and sprinted toward the maintenance ladder that led to the roof hatches. I climbed faster than I ever thought possible, my lungs burning and my vision blurring from the sheer terror of the moment. I reached the top, through the latch, and tumbled out onto the gravel-covered roof, the cold night air hitting me like a blessing from heaven. I didn't stop until I reached the edge of the building, screaming for help at the top of my lungs toward the distant lights of the main road. A passing patrol car, probably out looking for Black Friday shoplifters, saw my silhouette against the sky and pulled into the lot, their blue and red lights finally cutting through the darkness of my prison. I sat there in the rain, watching as the officers swarmed the building, knowing that the only reason I was still breathing was because I knew the layout of the floor just a little bit better than the man who tried to make it my grave. The heavy iron gate of the main entrance clicked into place with a sound that felt far too much like the door of a prison cell slamming shut for my liking. It was 4 in the morning, and the tidal wave of Black Friday shoppers had finally receded, leaving the mall a hollowed-out shell of discarded hangers, crumpled receipts, and the faint, lingering scent of cheap perfume and desperation. I was part of the skeleton crew assigned to stay behind and prep the storefront for the Saturday morning rush, a task that usually felt mind-numbing but tonight felt strangely suffocating as the overhead stadium lights began to hiss and fade into a dim, amber emergency glow. I was standing near the center fountain, watching the water ripple in the dark, when I noticed a group of 5 men in reflective yellow vests pushing heavy industrial cleaning carts toward the high-end jewelry wing. I didn't think much of it at first because the deep clean crews are a staple of the holiday season, but something about the way they moved made the hair on my arms stand straight up. They weren't looking at the floors or the glass partitions. They were fanning out in a tactical diamond formation, their eyes scanning the dark balconies above them instead of the grime below. I realized with a sudden, sickening jolt of adrenaline that I hadn't seen a cleaning contractor's van in the loading bay when I arrived, and these men were carrying heavy, long-handled duffel bags that seemed far too weighted down to contain mops or microfiber cloths. I took a step back into the shadow of a large decorative planter, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, and I watched as the leader of the group reached into his vest and pulled out a heavy black radio that didn't look like any mall security equipment I had ever seen. "Sector 3 is clear. Start the jammer now," he whispered into the device, his voice carrying through the vast, empty atrium with a chilling clarity that made my blood run cold. A second later, the faint bars of signal on my smartphone vanished into a hollow gray circle, and the digital clock on the wall above the food court began to flicker and spin as if the very air had become electrified. I was trapped in a 3-level concrete labyrinth with a group of professional thieves who had just cut my only lifeline to the outside world, and I was the only witness to a heist that was being executed with military precision. I knew I had to find the night security guard, a retired cop named Arthur who usually sat in the basement monitoring station, but to get to the elevators, I would have to cross 60 feet of open marble floor that offered absolutely no cover from the men in the yellow vests. I began to move, staying low and keeping my back against the cold glass of the storefronts, the shadows of the mannequins casting long, distorted shapes that looked like grasping hands in the dim light. I reached the service corridor behind the shoe store, a narrow hallway filled with the smell of cardboard and industrial adhesive, and I sprinted toward the stairs that led to the underground levels. Every sound was magnified 1,000 times in the silence. The squeak of my sneakers sounded like a gunshot, and the heavy thud of my breathing felt loud enough to wake the dead. I reached the heavy steel door of the security office and threw it open, expecting to see Arthur's friendly face behind the wall of monitors. But the room was a chaotic mess of overturned chairs and smashed screens. Arthur wasn't there, but his radio was lying on the floor, emitting nothing but a low, rhythmic static that sounded like a warning from a different world. I realized then that I wasn't just dealing with a group of opportunistic looters. These people had planned this for months, and they had neutralized the only person who could have helped me before the first gate was even locked. I felt a wave of cold nausea wash over me as I realized the cleaning crew wasn't just here for the jewelry. They were here to scrub the building of any witnesses who might interfere with their exit. I heard the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the concrete stairs above me, a sound that told me one of them had seen me slip into the basement and was coming down to finish the job. I looked around the small, cramped office for anything I could use as a weapon, my eyes landing on a heavy metal fire extinguisher mounted near the door and a set of heavy-duty zip ties on the desk. I grabbed the extinguisher, its cold weight a small comfort in the darkness, and I ducked behind the heavy steel filing cabinets just as the door creaked open on its hinges. A sliver of light from the hallway spilled across the floor, and I saw the shadow of a man holding a silenced pistol, the long barrel reflecting the red light of the recording lamp on the broken console. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace, checking the corners of the room with a practiced efficiency that told me he had done this many times before. "I know you're in here, kid, and I promise it's much easier if you just come out and talk to us," he said, his voice a low, soothing purr that was more terrifying than a scream. He was closing the distance to the cabinets. His footsteps so quiet they were almost non-existent. And I knew I only had one chance to make a move before he turned the corner and found me huddled in the dark. I waited until I could see the tip of his boot, and then I squeezed the trigger of the fire extinguisher, sending a blinding, high-pressure cloud of white chemical powder directly into his face. He let out a choked cry of surprise and pain as the freezing chemicals burned his eyes and lungs, and I didn't wait to see him fall. I swung the heavy canister with both hands, catching him in the shoulder and knocking him sideways into the desk. I scrambled past him, my lungs burning from the powder in the air, and I ran back out into the service corridor, my mind racing as I tried to remember the layout of the loading docks. I knew the main exits were deadlocked, but the trash compactor chute in the back of the food court led directly to the external bins. A tight squeeze that was usually off-limits, but was now my only hope for survival. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, my legs feeling like lead and my chest heaving, as the sounds of shouting echoed from the atrium above. They knew I was loose now, and the hunt had shifted from a quiet heist to a frantic search and destroy mission. I reached the food court, the smell of stale grease and floor wax thick in the air, and I saw the glowing green light of the compactor unit at the far end of the darkened hall. I dove over the counter of a burger joint and slid across the greasy floor, reaching the heavy metal hatch just as the first flashlight beam cut through the darkness from the balcony above. "There he is!" a voice boomed, followed by the sharp, metallic snap of a bullet hitting the plastic menu board just inches above my head. I didn't look back. I threw myself into the narrow, dark opening of the chute and let gravity take me, sliding down the cold metal tube into a mountain of discarded cardboard and plastic wrap. The impact at the bottom knocked the wind out of me, but I scrambled out of the bin and into the freezing night air, the streetlights of the perimeter road looking like the most beautiful things I had ever seen. I ran toward the nearest police substation 2 blocks away, my voice finally returning as I screamed for help into the empty street. By the time the sirens began to wail and the blue lights flooded the mall parking lot, I was sitting on the curb with a shock blanket around my shoulders, watching as the cleaning crew tried to flee into the woods. I had gone into the mall looking to earn a little extra holiday pay, but I walked away with the terrifying knowledge that sometimes the biggest monsters aren't the crowds, but the people who wait for the crowds to go home.